As process theologians, we believe that God experiences what we experience. And so God suffers in our sufferings. And so God survives with us through our sufferings and our abuses.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I are going to catch up, talk about the upcoming solar eclipse, and then later on the pod, we sit down with Grace Ji-Sun Kim and Susan Shaw. They've got a brand new book out titled Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. It's going to be a good pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am preparing myself for darkness to descend upon the earth.
All right. So that could be one of three things. Is that the state of our nation? Is that the solar eclipse or me? I'm not sure. What are we talking about here?
Well, there is a big blob coming out of Mar-a-Lago these days that could cover the sun. And, you know, we could talk about your attitude, but no, I'm talking about the solar eclipse coming up this Monday.
Okay, so we did discuss briefly talking about the eclipse in the intro, to which you just gave me a complete beat down look and said, are we going to have a quiz?
I mean, I was fully anticipating.
I said, no, but I do have some information.
Oh, okay. So
however, I didn't lie. I just changed the plan.
Of course you did. So it's a mini quiz.
Well,
it just doesn't count against my grade. Is that what I'm hearing?
This is not okay. That's a great way to put it. This is not for a grade. This is just for fun.
Okay, let's do
right.
that. Yeah.
Okay, so for those who don't know or didn't listen last week, at the end of our episode, we talked to Deborah Harsma about the eclipse.
Yes,
she's
astrophysicist.
An astrophysicist. Yes. So at the end of our conversation, we talked about it, and her excitement just really was, I don't know, infectious.
Oh, she was so excited about it.
So I started looking into it, and we are going to attempt to see it.
Yes, we are.
If we can make our way to Dallas, we are going to attempt to see totality. However, we've just been notified it might be cloudy.
Wah,
so
wah, wah.
TBD on that. But in the meantime, I did, per usual, Google.
Yeah.
Eclipse. Fun facts.
We're gonna have to. I mean, Google gives us so much information.
unlike Googling rededicating your life to Christ, fun facts. There were a good amount of results, but I chose USA Today. They had some great information I thought would be fun for us to talk about because this has been a big topic of conversation in our house as this event has completely changed all of our plans from professional to personal, everything else. Our life has been definitely affected by this event.
We have been eclipsed by the eclipse. Absolutely.
Truly, that has been the subject line of a few emails of yours. Okay, April 8th, a total solar eclipse will travel across the U.S. and be visible from parts of 13 states: Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So USA Today reached out to experts to get some interesting facts.
Okay.
Number one, Einstein's theory of relativity was proven during an eclipse.
Really?
During a solar eclipse in 1919, Arthur Eddington was able to test and prove Einstein's theory of relativity by observing the position of the stars in relation to the sun.
Wow. That's amazing.
Don't ask me to explain it.
we need Deb back.
I know, we do. Ask Angela Speck, professor of astrophysics at the University of Texas, San Antonio, who delivered this fun fact. Okay. Mm-hmm. Number two.
All right.
This is a quiz question. By how much will the average temperature drop during a total eclipse?
17 degrees.
Nope.
4 degrees Celsius.
Are you expecting me to calculate that in my head? Okay.
1 degree Kelvin. I'm just calling out names now.
During a total eclipse, the temperature shifts dramatically. This shift will vary based on location, but will drop about 10 degrees Fahrenheit on average.
Wow.
This, according to Dan Schneiderman, Eclipse Partnerships Coordinator at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. I found the fact that there exists a position of Eclipse Partnerships Coordinator equally as interesting as the fun fact itself.
Wow. Well, I mean, we're all about partnerships. Maybe we need to reach out to the Eclipse.
As I put feelers out there for new jobs.
Didn't know the Eclipse had its own staff members, so that's awesome.
I will be applying for the Eclipse Partnership Coordinator position when dear old Dan retires. Okay.
Well, whoever's doing marketing for the Eclipse is doing a brilliant job.
Absolutely. It's brilliant. Like I almost got sucked in and ordered us t-shirts. I'm not even kidding. I didn't. You're welcome. So, number 3, this is just a fun fact. Wildlife will respond to the shifting light of an eclipse. As the partial eclipse progresses and the sky darkens, birds will begin their early evening routine of flocking and swarming and chirping loudly. As we plunge into the darkness of totality, birds will land and go quiet.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Will you do your pre-evening routine as well?
Yes.
I'm not going to reveal what that is.
Like curl up on the couch with a blanket, a beverage, in some form of like trash reality TV.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's will start happening. Okay. You'll see Bailey's beads moments before totality. I'm sure you know what that is, right?
Bailey's beads?
Bailey's beads.
I have no idea.
So I just thought of a great theme drink. We need to have some Bailey's Irish cream on hand. Okay. Yay.
Okay. So what is Bailey's beads?
So in the seconds before totality occurs, it will seem like light is dancing on the sides of the moon. This phenomenon, known as Bailey's beads, was named after a 19th century English astronomer, Francis Bailey. It occurs when the moon's craters and valleys break up the light.
Wow.
This is according to someone named Schneiderman, with the last name of Schneiderman, at Rochester Museum and Science Center.
Well, lift a glass of Bailey's for Bailey's.
I mean, I think
his lights.
I mean, we have to, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's just logical.
Goes against nature not to.
Okay, I agree. So eclipses mean different things to different cultures. I know you will enjoy this one. Different cultures have their interpretations of eclipses. In ancient China, dragons were said to be eating the sun. Oh. Yeah, people would bang on drums to frighten the dragons away.
Excellent.
Love that. So that's, I mean, in ancient minds, you're trying to make sense of things. I love that. In Navajo culture, eclipses are seen as a time for rebirth and quiet reflection.
So while you're drinking Bailey's, I'm going to be quiet over there meditating.
Yes, absolutely. We'll all deal in our own way. It's fine. That's from Lakeisha Harding, Director of Equitable Evaluation and Impact at Thinkery Austin.
Excellent.
So next fun fact, stars and planets will be visible. If you're located in an area with little light pollution, you'll be able to see some of the brightest stars like Orion and even a few planets, notably Jupiter and Venus. Jupiter.
Wow.
Wait.
Do they add a planet?
Wait. Okay. Notably, Jupiter and Venus. That's from, again, Schneiderman at Rochester Museum and Science Center. Number 7 is a question. Just like tornado chasers, eclipse chasers also exist. What are they called?
Eclipsers?
That's a great guess. Okay, I'm going to have to pronounce this. Known as umbraphiles.
Umbraphiles.
Umbraphiles,
okay.
which I would think would be like bra chasers, because umbraphiles. Those only existed in my youth group.
I'm not good. I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that alone.
Digress. Okay, sorry. We're getting off the rails. Known as umbraphiles, which means shadow lovers, eclipse chasers are known to plan their world travels around pursuing eclipses. They use a variety of tools and observe eclipses in different ways and from various perspectives, such as from an airplane or in a forest.
I just thought of something.
What?
For those areas of totality, vampires get 4 extra minutes in their day.
Oh, true. I wonder if they celebrate like Leap Day?
I don't know. I just thought of that.
All right, we'll have to research that further. Okay, so you are going to be super interested in this because these next 3 points, which I will try to do quickly, kind of speak to your attitude about this eclipse, which has generally been ambivalence, right?
Pretty much.
Okay, so number 8, the Earth will eventually not have eclipses.
Really?
Yes. This is a unique...
Because it's going to be consumed in fire, as the Bible has taught us?
Because climate change is going to ruin us all? Yes, likely. But
keeping it on a positive note.
But scientifically and mathematically speaking, this is a unique time in the Earth's history. The moon is moving about an inch away from the Earth each year. The distances between the Earth and the moon and the Earth and the sun make their sizes appear almost the same, allowing for the occurrence of total eclipses. Eventually, Earth will only get annular eclipses. Annular? I don't know. Pronunciation is important in that word, and I don't know how to do it. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah.
That's very interesting.
Isn't it?
I didn't realize the moon is moving away from us.
Yes.
But after the last 8 years, I don't blame the moon for moving away.
Absolutely. And that was from Don Reifler, Science Programs Manager at the Children's Museum of Illinois. Okay, so...
Well, those are interesting.
I'm not done.
Oh, my goodness. I'm sorry.
Wait, there's more.
There's always more to tell.
That's right. So the next 2 are questions for you. How often does a total eclipse occur?
A total eclipse? Every 11 years.
No. We think of total eclipses as rare, but the occurrence of an eclipse isn't actually that rare. So you appreciate that, right? Because you've been like, yeah, whatever, on this whole thing. A total eclipse occurs about once every 18 months.
Really?
Yes. What?
Just depends on where you live if you get the total eclipse.
Right. But using logic, the Earth is 70% water.
Yeah.
So most eclipses occur over the open sea, and very few people observe them.
Sea life has all the breaks. They get all the good stuff.
Again, from Don Reifler, Science Programs Manager at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. And my final thought. How often can a total eclipse be viewed from the same location?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I'm going to go with every 100 years.
No. While a total eclipse is not rare, the opportunity to observe an eclipse from the same location is incredibly rare. A total solar eclipse takes about 375 years to happen again in the same location.
Wow.
This is from Summer Murphy, an early learning specialist at the Museum of Discovery in Little Rock. Do you know what else happens about once every 375 years?
So many things going through my head right now. And I do want credit for not saying
that
anything.
That was funny.
What happens every 365 years?
This state of ours, the state of Oklahoma, makes national news for a good reason.
Really? Something good happened in the Sooner State?
I am so proud of that segue.
Yeah,
I just
that was
need
very
it noted.
nice.
That's a
very
great
nice.
segue.
Well done.
Okay. This week, in the northwest Oklahoma city of Enid, and I'm quite confident that most of the nation has not heard of Enid, Oklahoma until this news hit national outlets. Right. But Enid ousted a city council member with ties to white nationalism.
Yay, Enid.
Yeah, so you told me a little bit about this yesterday, and then, election results came in earlier, and I was surprised. I don't know about you, but I was surprised to learn it wasn't an election, but they literally ousted this city council member. Mm-hmm. Did you know that?
I did know that.
Oh, okay. Well, fine. All right.
Yeah. So this council member, and remind me his name?
His name is Judd Blevins.
So, of course it is. Anybody who's seen the musical
Judd.
Oklahoma listening to Judd.
Poor Judd, I think.
Judd, I think it is. Poor Judd up there in Enid decided back in 2017 to go out to Charlottesville, Virginia, and attend the rally for white supremacy.
The Unite the Right rally.
Yeah.
Which, quick plug for our book, Standing Up to Hate.
Absolutely.
Which,
Michael Chuck and the Charlottesville Clergy
yes.
Collective have a book about
published,
what happened the night
published
before
by Good
and
Faith
that day.
Media and Nurturing Faith about that day.
So 2 women in Enid found out, saw his picture, and began a recall of the city council member, and it succeeded yesterday. They have ousted him. So good job, City of Enid.
Absolutely. And good job to best friends Connie Vickers and Nancy Presnell, who decided they needed to do something about this. That's incredible.
Absolutely.
He was also admitted being connected to the now defunct white supremacist group Identity Europa. The fact that I don't know the name of this group, just says a lot of good things about me, but I don't know how to say this.
Right.
But in any case, I think that's a good sign. And
it's a great sign.
in our own little town of Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma, lives and thrives, we had a school board election that you and I referenced, several episodes ago. Yeah. One of the candidates who was running with the last name of Christian, unironically, I don't know, whose children do not attend public schools, who is not involved with public schools, was on the ballot along with a candidate who has been a public school teacher, does currently have children within the public school, and I believe she currently works at the University of Oklahoma, and she defeated him for the
I was
school
so
board
excited to see that take place here in our city. Because there, as we have talked about on numerous occasions here at Good Faith Media and on Good Faith Weekly, that there is a well-funded concerted effort to take over school boards and to advance the cause of vouchers, tax credits, and school choice. And this is just another attempt in that long process. And this candidate was defeated. What made this even more appalling, Missy, and I threw it away before I brought it into the house, but there was actually a mail out that went out a couple of days before the election vilifying this educator.
Wow.
And it wasn't paid for by her opponent who got defeated yesterday or this week, but it was by a group that wrote these scathing remarks, quoted students, supposedly students of her, criticizing her as a teacher. And it was, this is where we are in America these days. And this is where individuals like Christensen and those who support him, especially with big money, this is their goal, is to take over local schools, local governments, state governments, and eventually the entire country. And it is frightening, but there are glimmers of hope, as we saw this week.
There are glimmers of hope as our state shows, some sensibilities. Other states who have, for example, Kansas and others who've put, reproductive rights and abortion on the ballot have been, defeated by wide margins. There are some glimmers of hope. There is some sensibility. So I'm trying to have a little bit of hope. I don't know. We'll get there.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hope, you and I got to sit down with 2 incredible theologians this week, Grace Ji-Sun Kim and Susan Shaw. They've got a brand new book out entitled Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. And it was a really great conversation, and the book is really well done, addressing one of the most important topics that we're facing, not only as a community of faith, but as a country and a global community as well. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Grace Ji-Sun Kim and Susan Shaw.
This episode is brought to you by the Summit for Religious Freedom.
Christian nationalists, extremists, and their political allies are working overtime to impose their narrow religious beliefs on all of us.
Learn how to fight back at the Summit for Religious Freedom on April 13th to the 16th in Washington, D.C. We're organizing to defend LGBTQ+ rights, abortion, contraception, and reproductive rights, our public schools, our democracy, and the separation of church and state.
The Summit for Religious Freedom is the hub for this collective fight. TheSRF.org. That's THESRF.org. Has all the details. Use promo code GOODFAITH for 10% off registration.
Anyone can attend virtually, and current students can attend the summit virtually for free. Scholarships are also available.
SRF sold out last year and tickets are going fast. Don't sleep on this. Visit thesrf.org today and don't forget to use promo code GOODFAITH for 10% off registration.
The summit is hosted by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Freedom without favor and equality without exception.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got two very special guests with us. Grace Ji-sun Kim is a Korean-American theologian and professor of theology at Ehrlman School of Religion. She is best known for books and articles on the social and religious experiences of Korean women, immigrants to North America. Susan Shaw is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Oregon State University. She is also an ordained Baptist minister and holds MA and PhD degrees from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The two have a brand new book out, just released, Surviving God, a new vision of God through the eyes of sexual abuse survivors. Grace and Susan, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. It's so good to see you, Mitch and Missy and Susan. So thank you so much for having us on Good Faith Media.
So Grace, we're going to start with you. I want to talk, before we get into the meat of the book, I really want to talk about the title. It's quite provocative, Surviving God. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Tell us what that means and how you came up with it.
Yeah, sure. When it comes to book titles, I always have a hard time. And in many cases, the publisher changes the title that we propose and we submit. But I think, Susan, they kept the one that we submitted. So Susan and I, because the book is dealing with sexual abuse survivors, we cover a lot of ground in the book. And one part of the book is talking about God and who God is. So there's a double-sided meaning to the book in that many of us may have grown up with an image or an understanding of a patriarchal God, a king God, a colonial, imperial God. And these are, very destructive. They kind of allow abuse to happen. And so in one sense, we're trying to survive this God that we grew up with. And on the other side, we also deal with the abuse, the possible abuse, or, some scholars have looked at when we're thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus, what really happened on that night of his arrest. We know that some parts that he was physically abused, they were lashes and he was given a crown of thorns. That's all physical abuse. But then we know that in times of war, or when you are arrested, or when there is colonialism and you are living under colonialism, also sexual violence does happen. So we deal with that too. And there's a lot of other dimensions to the book. And I think Susan could elaborate a bit further, but it is a striking title. It's a complex title, and we hope that will draw people to read the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and to build on that, we also were thinking about God having to survive a lot of really bad theology.
Yes, God does.
That's a great point.
And also, as process theologians, we believe that God experiences what we experience. And so God suffers in our sufferings. And so God survives with us through our sufferings and our abuses. And that was another way we understood. So it had these sort of multi layers to it. And we liked, of course, that it was provocative and that our publisher let us keep it. We were happy about that.
Absolutely. So, okay, you mentioned a term in there that I want you to elaborate on a little bit for us, process theology. Can you talk to us about what that means?
Right. Yeah, well, process theology, it actually grows out of the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, which grows out of quantum physics.
wait. Maybe we don't want to get that.
We're going to need a whiteboard, Susan.
The important thing about process theology is that it says that God is in every particle of the universe. And so God experiences everything that the universe experiences. And the way that God is in the universe is as persuasive love, not coercive power. And so that's kind of what's at the center of it. So it's this God who is everywhere, but not in sort of the sense that we've traditionally been taught about sort of God as power and God as in control, but rather God as experiencing what every particle of God's universe experiences.
Yeah, I love that. So in the book, you both share your life experiences. That is a part of each chapter, and I really appreciate that. In one section, you admit the way you think about God and experience the divine is recognized through your gender, ethnicity, sexual identities, physical and mental abilities, social class, education, and age. However, you also consider the need to hear the experiences and perspectives of people who differ from you to understand God more fully. So let's start with Grace. Why is it important to consider the experiences of others when developing a new understanding of God? Because let's just be honest, growing up evangelicals as we did, there was such a strong emphasis on the personal, on the individualistic components of a personal relationship with God. But what you're saying is to develop a fuller identity or a fuller theology or doctrine of God, to use a old systematic theology term. We need to really understand the experiences of others. So can you elaborate on that, Grace, and then Susan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think many of us kind of grew up with that. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical church, and so did Susan. And then we get this very narrow perspective of who God is, this personal Lord and Savior that you just talked about. But I think we need to recognize the infinite God. We are finite beings, and we are trying to understand the infinite. So we can never understand the fullness of God. We never will. Augustine said, if you think that is God, that is not God. We just cannot come because of our limited brain cells and how we can think. We can never understand the fullness of God, but we come to understand God from our own experiences. So I always teach theology is biography and biography is theology. So we come to understand who God is and the fullness, or try to achieve the fullness of God from my own personal experience. So in our previous book, Intersectional Theology, when we're looking at our identities, we're not this one-dimensional people. You know, myself, I am an able, educated, and immigrant, a woman of color, heterosexual. There's all these dimensions of who I am. So recognizing that and recognizing that this world is diverse. And that's why it's important to have everyone at the table when we're doing theological discussion, when we're trying to understand who God is. I think for the last 2,000 years, we had only basically white male, probably heterosexual perspective. So the white Euro perspective, and that was so narrow, and it perpetuated this maleness, this patriarchal understanding of who God is. And that kind of feeds into subordination, subjugation of people of color, and then violence towards women. So our book, you know, if we're going to keep upholding that kind of theology and being very narrow and not welcoming the other voices, the other diverse people, diverse ethnically and culturally, socioeconomically, then we are always going to have a narrow perspective of God. And God is infinite. So we have to allow ourselves to listen and learn from other people, especially those who are so different from us. We really need to move in that direction.
Yeah, in the earlier book, we talked about the need for theology to be what we call kaleidoscopic. And by that, we mean that theology is not fixed or static, but rather it's ever changing. And at best, what we believe at any given moment is tentative, because as Grace said, we're finite beings. Our perceptions, our experiences are pretty narrowly limited in terms of the scope of human experience. And so we always have to be sort of shifting our perspective to see new things. But even when we do that, we can only see what we can see. And we have so many more experiences in the world that can teach us things. And so I think just the conversations Grace and I have in our writing together. And so Grace is Korean. So she's introduced me to ideas like Han, which is unjust suffering that we talk about in the book, which she actually taught me in relation to this experience I have as a woman who went to Southern Seminary during the fundamentalist takeover, with the sense that we can never get past that moment. And I didn't know how to describe that feeling, but it was Han. It was the perfect word for it. I couldn't come up with that on my own. There's not a name in English for that experience, and Han was the perfect name for it. And so I think that's the value of hearing from people whose experiences are so diverse. I love to read Musa Dubé's biblical interpretation. She's from Botswana. And so the way she sees things as an African woman, I could never see things that way. And I learned so much from her, from Huac Puilan, who is another Asian theologian who, again, brings those lenses. I believe she's from Taiwan, right, Grace? Is that?
It's either Taiwan or Hong Kong. I just can't remember at this moment. But
yeah, and so this different perspective that shows me something I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I would never have seen God in the particular ways that are limited by my experience that I can see by listening to people like those theologians and everyday people as well. Musa Dubé is really big on everyday people's interpretations because of those perspectives they can bring.
Well, I really appreciate this section of the book and your explanation of how this comes to be, because myself, I am a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and I've been decolonizing my faith for quite some time now. But in that decolonization of faith, I've been able to embrace my indigenous heritage and ancestry, and even though they don't really have a term for the religious components of it, the religious components of my indigenous culture. And it has really opened my eyes to Scripture in a more beautiful way than it ever has, by embracing these cultural nuances that make me who I am. So I really appreciated this part and that explanation immensely. So thanks for proving that I'm not a heretic. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that.
I don't know if we said that or
not. Point taken.
I think, Mitch, we need to hear more from your indigenous Native American perspective, because that is so valuable in our biblical understanding. And, these days with climate change, this climate crisis that we're dealing with. And I know Good Faith Media has been covering a lot of that. So I think, your voice is so crucial. So I hope that we can hear more of it, and we'll bring more different diverse voices to the table, because they all enrich, because, the English language is so limiting. Yeah. And then French has other vocabulary, indigenous cultures have different words and terms. And all of these really help us to understand this mysterious being, divine being that we are, whom we call creator, sustainer, however you want to call God. And the more terms and the more words that we have, the better we will come to a more deeper and fuller understanding of who God is.
Yeah.
And let me give you just a specific example of why that's important. So if we look at the story of Rahab, in the First Testament, so she's the sex worker living on the wall of the city of Jericho, helps Joshua and the spies. Now, as a white feminist, the way I had heard other white feminists interpret the story is Rahab becomes this hero, right? Is she chose the right side, she was a leader, so on and so forth. But when I've read indigenous feminist scholars writing about this, what they say is she was a Pocahontas who betrayed her own people to further the colonial causes of the Israeli Empire. And so, and that's quite open. And the thing is, like a kaleidoscope, you can hold both of those views at the same time and it can be equally valid. So it's not a matter of choosing which one's the right one. I mean, we have to get away from that notion that there's one right answer, but rather I can say, oh, both of these are true. Rahab can be a hero and she can be a Pocahontas, and then I love it because out of people who have been engaged in sex work, they'll raise the question of, well, and why was she having to engage in sex work anyway? What was wrong with the social system that led her there and put her on the edge of the community? I mean, so there are all these questions that, again, not in my experience, I wouldn't think to ask them that way. Right. So it's really important. And I agree with Grace. We definitely need to hear more from indigenous folks to help us deal with some of, particularly the colonial entanglements of the Bible and theology.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think we got the title of your next book, and that is Kaleidoscope Theology. I love that idea and that concept.
Thank you.
Well, Grace and Susan, you may not have heard this, but there seems to be a growing movement within conservative evangelical circles to infuse extreme masculinity into God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. This is what I call Jesus with muscles holding an AK-47 kind of imagery. The traditional Godhead evolves into this strong, powerful, violent, divine presence rather than a God seeking mercy, love, and justice. So you address this in the book to some extent. So how important were the Me Too and Church Too movements in reassessing this toxic masculinity of the Christian faith and practice? And what changes have you seen from those two movements? And for those of us who are out here, trying to counter that, how can we combat this toxic masculinity in our churches, our homes, and communities? So, Susan, let's go ahead. We've let Grace start the last couple of times. Let's start with you.
You raised the question about combating toxic masculinity, and that made me think of interpretation that I love, a feminist interpretation of the story of Jesus and the woman who was almost stoned. And we talk about her in the book, but as people are trying to figure out, what does all of this mean? One of the feminist interpretations is what Jesus is really doing is actually renouncing his own privilege to side with this woman, and that really he is issuing a call for other men to renounce their male privilege and toxic masculinity and to side with the oppressed. And I think that's the answer, is to recognize that patriarchy is sin, that toxic masculinity is sin, to use the theological language of the church. That sin's not only personal and individual, but it is structural and systemic. And so, I think Jesus calls on men to renounce that in the same way that I think, white folks are called to renounce racism and straight folks are called to renounce their heterosexism, and then actually to side with the oppressed, which I think is what Jesus did in the cross, is that he sided with the oppressed. And so I think that is a key. And of course, that flies in the face of this sort of muscular Christianity, is the name it had back in the days when the YMCA was just forming. And you first had those, images of muscular Jesus. And I think all that's a reaction to the progress that has been made as a result of the women's movement. And I think that it threatens that kind of dominating masculinity. And I think we haven't yet really been able to develop for men those visions of positive masculinity in its place so that it doesn't feel like such a loss of identity, because our culture doesn't do that. It just simply continues to promote these ideas of, men as tough and hyper masculine and powerful. And then, of course, what comes with all of that is violent. And so we've got a lot of work to do there.
And in a lot of instances, it's so ingrained into our culture, even our church culture, that we don't even recognize it. And just the masculinity that's always present in there, from the language we use to, who gets called on to pray and all of that in the church. And so, Grace, how can we counter that? I mean, Susan did a good job saying standing up and speaking out. But like those little things,
like my life. Yeah. This is like my lifelong goal because it's a big struggle. I kind of grew up with that, and the church upholds that kind of theology, upholds this patriarchal, toxic masculinity. And you have to ask yourself, why is it doing that? Because if you look at the gospel, Jesus was far from that. Jesus was this meek and gentle, kind, loving, healing the lepers. Like nobody wanted to be with the lepers. Like, he was doing stuff that was not how the church has become. Mm-hmm. He was there talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. He was, with Peter's mother-in-law. He was with all these women, Mary Magdalene, and, so many people, the outcasts. So we have this kind of different view of who Jesus is in the gospel. But somehow in the last 2,000 years, we have turned Jesus into this emperor, riding on a white horse kind of image.
Right.
And, I think at the bottom line is it really serves those who are in power. So the last 2,000 years, it has been white male Europeans. So to maintain their own power, you have to kind of uphold and lift up this toxic masculinity. And I must add a white toxic masculinity, because it's white men who want to maintain their power and keep the status quo. So, this is all multidimensional. Why is this happening? Why does the church continue to uplift this? But it was to serve a purpose. And in that way, a lot of women have been abused. They have been silenced. Scripture has been misinterpreted and misused in so many ways. Women were not allowed to be ordained. The Catholic Church still doesn't ordain women. There's no priest, no pope, no bishops. So we have a long way to go. It's only the last 50, 60 years that, we have women ordained in some of these Protestant churches, and women theologians like Susan and I kind of writing now, trying to combat this toxic masculinity, which is destructive. We have to, as Susan said, name it as sin and label it as being so destructive. It allows violence to happen in the church. It allows war to happen. It allows genocide to happen. It allows, all these evil things, the genocide of Native Americans. All these things are intersecting and interrelated. And, we have to name it as evil so that we can prevent it from happening in other places around the world. We're seeing it right now. So we have to kind of combat this, destroy it, and move towards a different understanding of who God is, who Jesus is, because all of our images and our understanding really affects our own theology, our actions, our thinking, our behavior. So we have to, we compartmentalize so many things, but we have to recognize it's all intersecting. It is interrelated. So this question is so important. I hope the listeners will understand. We're not saying we hate men. It's not the same thing. It is saying this toxic masculinity has been so destructive in our society and also in the church.
Yeah. Well, and I think a good specific example that affects evangelicals particularly is the way purity culture has reinforced this. And so within purity culture, men have this just inherent uncontrollable sex drive, and therefore women have to be responsible for men's sexuality. And so if men cross a line, it was because the woman didn't do her job. I mean, it takes all moral responsibility off of men for sexual violence, and it blames women, and it creates such sexual shaming. And then that makes it impossible really for women to talk about it, to report it, to name it for what it is. And we see too, I mean, the ways that it works to maintain power. If you just look at the Southern Baptist Convention right now, I mean, they have a sex abuse scandal of incredible proportions on their hands, and they muck up the response to it every time they open their collective or individual mouths. And here you've got right now, finally, all this stuff about Paul Pressler has been made public. The conventions had to recognize. And for those who don't know, Paul Pressler was one of the architects of the takeover.
Oh, we've talked about the judge on this program many times.
Well, and then you have Al Mohler, who's still saying, the president of Southern Seminary, that he just can't believe that this would be true. I mean, this is how deep this stuff is. Yeah. And so every time that happens, people are re-traumatized and re-victimized by the church's response. It's poorly thought out, poorly executed response to survivors. And so the SBC can, talk all day about how awful sexual abuse is, but at the end of the day, they go out and file an amicus brief to make sure that institutions that allow or enable abuse don't have to pay for it.
Right.
So it's like Grace said, it's all so interrelated. This is the systemic part of it. So it's not just an individual problem, it's systemic. And as long as those systems are in place, they're going to reproduce themselves, and we're going to stay where we are.
So that's a great kind of segue into just something that really resonated with me, the chapter about surviving God. When you discuss the problems with, the whole ideology of God has a plan, and which makes God an accomplice to abuse. Let's talk for a minute about the damage this does, and maybe talk a little bit in your responses about how this played into your decision to write this book and really, share some vulnerabilities that were probably really difficult to share and put out on paper. So Susan, let's start with you.
Yeah. So growing up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, I was taught God's in control of everything. And you had the perfect will of God and the permissive will of God. And so this is how, Southern Baptists navigate that tricky terrain between free will and predestination. And so the perfect will of God is everything God wants to happen. And the permissive will is how God lets us have free will. So maybe God doesn't want abuse to happen, but God allows it because people have free will to make bad choices. So for me, growing up in all of that with my own abuse as a child, I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. Because of course it was my fault, because I should have stopped it. And this is how my little 11, 12, 13-year-old brain was processing these things within this context. And so those were my prayers, is help me be strong enough to stop this. Now looking back, I mean, how traumatizing is that to imagine a child praying? And yet that's what it was. And then as I moved into young adulthood and developed critical thinking capacities and started to learn to ask hard questions, I stopped to ask, what kind of God would allow abuse to happen? And if God could have intervened and chose not to, I was done with God.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because that's not there is no lesson I needed to be taught that way. And for me, that was the moment where it was like, okay, now what? And this is where process theology saved me, right? This is why I love process, because that's where I found the answer that God is not controlling. God is not coercive power, but persuasive love. So God doesn't make things happen. In fact, God cannot make those things. God can only do what God can do, and God cannot do what God cannot do. And And so God did not will it, God did not cause it, God did not allow it. And in fact, God suffered with me in it, and God called my abuser to do better, but my abuser didn't listen.
Mm.
And that really is the only thing that allowed me to stay Christian. If I hadn't discovered process theology, I don't know, I was probably on my way out the door because I
Right.
was done with that
Sure.
particular kind of God.
Wow.
So Grace,
A
how
lot of
about
people
you?
leave Christianity because of things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, thanks, Susan, for sharing that. I grew up with, everything happens for a reason, and I think Amy Grant maybe had a song about that. But I always felt like God was in control of everything because that's what I was taught at church. But if God is in control, how can enslavement happen? How can genocide happen? How can the sexual violent acts towards women and also men continue to happen? So this is very, very problematic. And, I think the listeners, everyone needs to struggle with understanding who God is, because even if you grew up in the church, if you grew up with bad theology that allows this toxic masculinity to happen, this violence towards other people to happen, it is very problematic. We really need to read scripture, interpret scripture in light of love, in light of grace and mercy, rather than through the patriarchal lens that the church has been reading have been using for the last 2,000 years. It's very problematic. And so even the understanding of who God is and the images of God, there are feminine images of who God is, but they have been pushed aside for the last 2,000 years. And it needs, we need more women to kind of dig into this. We know why it happened. So now we have to retrieve it and use these images that God is beyond this kind of white and male, kind of old man sitting up in the sky. God is spirit. God is love. God is a mother hen. God is like a bird hovering. There's so many images. God is wisdom. All these feminine images that are helpful, that are loving, those are the images that we really need to emphasize, especially when we're talking about sexual violence within the church. Because in many cases, we have said or allowed or kind of push things underneath the rug saying it's okay because, somehow God allows it to happen. There's a lesson in here to learn. We're going to get stronger and we're going to get better because of this experience. We've given too many excuses like that. So we have to stop, and we really need to think differently, reinterpret scripture differently in light of Native Americans, in light of women, in light of African Americans, all these different diverse lenses we need to use so that we can correct all this terrible theology that has been taught and perpetuated for too long.
I love that. Now, I want to bring up as a final question before we get to our more to tell. There's a section in the book that I unashamedly say I had to wipe away a tear. And it's when you talk about God as the survivor. When you do that, you quote feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson. And Johnson wrote, God takes the pain of the world into the divine being in order there to redeem it. And by doing this, you write these words, and this is what really touched my soul. Then we can imagine God as a young gay man dying on a fence in Wyoming, a trans woman being beaten to death, a Korean comfort woman, an altar boy being abused, and so many others, abuse victims. This way of identifying with God as survivor is an invitation for us to see God in an entirely new light. So, Grace, why is it so important for survivors of sexual violence to relate to God in this light?
I think, there are too many of us out there, both women and men. And in our own struggles, in our own pain, some do not survive. Some do survive. And as we are surviving, we have to, of course, many have left the church. Many have said there's nothing salvific in the church. There's, God there, So for us as survivors, it's important to ask the question, who is God? If God didn't allow it, then where is God? And how do we experience God? And we experience God in our own experiences of brokenness, in our own experiences of abuse. And that's why, I'm a Presbyterian, but I teach in a Quaker school. And, the Quakers say that of God in everyone. Mm-hmm. If we can find God in everyone, then why are we being so exclusive in our churches that we cannot have X, Y, and Z, or we cannot ordain X, Y, and Z people because, there's something wrong. If God is in all of us, then why can't we accept everybody? I'm in a middle-class church, but many of our churches are kind of middle class. If a poor homeless person walks in, we all gasp and we're like terrified. Are they here to rob us or take something from the church? We have all these thoughts, and we're scared of people who are so different from us, those who are trans or those who are in the LGBTQ community, etc. We're so afraid. But if we can recognize God in each of us, then I think that gives us a lot of comfort. And, our book is about sexual abuse. And for many of us who have been abused, and we struggled so much, many people struggle with it all their life. We really want to understand that God is within us and among us. Yeah. And God experiences the pain that we are all going through.
Yeah. Susan?
And I think to build on what Grace said, that we have to grapple with this to get to what we talk about in the last chapter of the book, which is about joy. Mm-hmm. And, Matthew Fox says that our ecstasies are experiences of God, that God is in our joy. And I can't get to joy with a God that would let a little child be sexually abused. But when I think about a God who has suffered with us and a God who calls us to be more than we even think we can be, I can get to joy. I can find that joy and that of God in every particle of the universe again. And in process theology, that's the point of it all, is joy. Yeah. Not like hedonism, not, right, all those things that evangelicals are so afraid of. But joy is that attentiveness to every moment that you're living in, so that you are fully present in your own life, fully attentive to all those things that spark joy, to borrow that phrase.
Right.
And so within process, anything that gets in the way of joy is sin and evil, and abuse can do that. And if we don't deal with that abuse, it stays in the way of our joy. And for me, having finally worked through all of this, not that it doesn't still bother me, not that I can't get worked up about it, but I've been able later in life to find this way to live in joy almost every moment of every day.
Well, Susan and Grace, thank you so much for being our guests this week on Good Faith Weekly. The book is Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. But before we let you go, Missy's got one last question that we ask every guest here at Good Faith Weekly.
So Grace and Susan, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today, the work that you do, or anything else you'd like to leave the listener with, what is your more to tell? We'll start with Grace.
I've done stuff with Good Faith Media in the past, so it's great to collaborate and write, and I've been interviewed by Cliff, but this is the first podcast, and it's been a joy to be interviewed by a husband and wife. So Missy and Mitch, it's like a new goal for me in life that I need to do something with my husband.
Well, we'll talk offline about that before you.
What was that?
I said we'll have to talk offline about that here in a minute. I might have a few warnings.
I know. I've almost been married 29 years. It's hard to work with your spouse in anything. I remember when I was a PhD student and my advisor co-wrote a book with his wife. And I was so naive. I'm in my 20s and I said, oh my gosh, I said, that's so beautiful. I said, oh, that is so good that you and your wife can work on a book together. And he this is what he said. He said, Grace, we're just lucky to be still married to one another. I know how hard it is, but it's great to watch you two kind of collaborate and be such great hosts for this Good Faith Weekly. I think it's a goal for me now as I witness you two doing it so beautifully. So anyway, we can talk offline later.
Here's the trick, Grace. We have a divorce decree right here laying in front of the soundboard. And so we know anyone can sign it.
Yes, I'm married a non-academic, and so we don't even have to go there. She helps keep me sane because she'll be like, "Why do you all do things like that? That makes no sense."
That's fantastic.
All right, Susan, how about you? What is your more to tell?
So my more to tell really is about women's basketball because, again, it's about finding those places and being attentive to joy. Mm-hmm. And when I experience that, the joy I feel is an experience of the divine. It is an experience of mystery, and I'm attentive to it in those ways. And I think if we could get away from the notion of God as the holy other who lives in the church or whatever up above, and really think about God as present in every particle of the universe, we could start to realize that when we have that moment, whether it's seeing a beautiful sunset or eating some divine chocolate or, listening to some rock and roll or whatever it is that makes that joy well up in you, and realize that that's God in us, God calling to us, God working in us. I just think the world would be a better place and we'd all be a lot happier in it.
I agree.
That's my something more.
I love it. Well, Susan and Grace, thank you so much for being with us. It has been a pure delight. Again, the book is Surviving God, a new vision of God through the eyes of sexual abuse survivors. You're going to want to pick up this book immediately so that you can begin reading it because it is very well done. And I love the cover, by the way. I love the fact that God is created in leaves and palms and just beautiful flowers. So I love that. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it was a joy to be with you and talk with you and Missy. Thank you so much.
I always love having theologians on the pod, Missy, because they challenge me. They force me to think outside my theological construct and the bubble that I often live in. And Drs. Shaw and Kim delivered. I loved the conversation we had, especially at the end when I was able to read that section of the book that talked about reimagining God. And because it was so powerful, I just want to read it one more time. They write, "We can imagine God as a young gay man dying on a fence in Wyoming, a trans woman being beaten to death, a Korean comfort woman, an altar boy being abused, and other abuse victims." Powerful.
Everything was powerful about the book and about the conversation. I think for me, as you and I discussed these interviews after and discussed the books and trying to really examine our faith in real time on this pod too, what stood out to me as so memorable and sensical is that as my faith has evolved and in my understanding that the God who was sold to me in in a system or within the walls of a particular church or under the guise of a particular minister is not the God is love that I want to know.
Absolutely.
And so the analogy that I think made the most sense to me was when they talked about the kaleidoscope.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that whenever we travel and go to the little, we kill time and go into the little boutiques, we find a main street to walk up and down. I love spending time at the kaleidoscopes, the fancy ones that
so fun.
I can't spend money on, but with the multiple dials, and I could watch them for hours, and I love them. So that as imagery of how my faith has evolved is really meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Because if my faith or any survivor of abuse within a system that told them that was God breathed,
right, sure,
to just simplify it, is not going to be a faith that I can hold on to.
I agree.
So to be as a human being, as a person that existed within a system, to be able to have that visual for me is very beautiful, that it is changing, that it can evolve, that I am able to still have faith in the God is love and not the God that the person told me was there controlling everything, that was complicit in the abuse, as we talked about early on. So I don't know, it really meant a lot to me. It's something I will cling to as I go forward, in that, and take a step back as humans. We've talked about this before in the pod. Mm-hmm. We do need to be evolving and changing. And if we're not, then we're not doing what we're supposed to do. So to be able to look at a situation or a system or kind of a construct that you've been brought up in, if you are a victim of abuse, and still be able to find that faith, to find that's where, Susan and Grace are just so inspirational, right? Because they are still able to say, you know what, you don't get to claim who God is.
Exactly.
And that is powerful. Mm-hmm. And that is empowering for someone like me who didn't suffer overt abuse, but definitely suffered under that system.
Yeah.
And still, grapples with and still wrestles with the effects of that today.
Right.
For them to be able to say, this institution doesn't get to define God for me.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Thinking about just kind of continuing that kaleidoscope metaphor that they used, listening to them talk and then just listening to you, I'm reminded of Paul's words when he talks about working out his own theology, and it's like looking through a glass dimly. Mm-hmm. That it's always changing. It's never in focus. And we always trying to bring it into focus, but it's always a mystery behind that dim glass. And while there are so many questions about life and about circumstances, the one thing that we can be certain is this, and people ask me all the time, what is your theology? And it really is simple, and that is God is love. And it goes back to the greatest commandments of love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And in my column this week, I mentioned those three things. Love God, love others, and love yourself. If you can learn to love those three entities in the world, then you might just be able to overcome anything.
And when you think about whether it's the system or the people in positions of power, the ministers, whoever it is, who took advantage of that dim glass and said, hey, I can paint this picture for you crystal clear.
Wow, yeah.
I think those who are able to overcome that and able to still see the God of love are the real heroes.
That is a perfect way to end the pod this week. Thank you for that. We'll be back next week with another guest. Until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.